The winter of 1942 settled over the Polish countryside like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. In the small town of Kolno, nestled between dense forests and frozen fields, the occupation had transformed everything familiar into something foreign and dangerous. The cobblestone streets that once echoed with the laughter of children now carried the sound of German military boots, their rhythmic march a constant reminder of whose authority ruled these lands. The town square, where farmers had sold their produce for generations, had been converted into a checkpoint, guarded by soldiers whose faces remained as cold as the winter air that cut through every layer of clothing. 32-year-old Helena Kowalska stood in the doorway of what had once been her family's bakery, watching the gray sky promise more snow. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver that had appeared in the months since the occupation began, was pulled back in a simple bun beneath a worn scarf. Her hands, callous and marked with small burns from years of working with ovens, clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders. The bakery itself had changed drastically. The warm yellow walls her father had painted were now dingy, the paint peeling from neglect and the dampness that seeped through every crack during winter. The large brick oven that had produced hundreds of loaves daily before the war now operated on severely rationed fuel, baking only what the German administration permitted and what meager supplies Helena could acquire through increasingly creative means. The occupation had stripped Kolno of its vitality. Buildings that once housed thriving businesses stood empty, their windows dark or shattered. The synagogue on the eastern edge of town had been burned 18 months earlier, its blackened skeleton a grim monument to the community that had been torn away in the night. The local school had been converted into German administrative offices, and the church bells, which had marked the hours for centuries, had been silenced by military order. Everything that had made Kolno feel like home had been systematically dismantled, replaced with curfews, ration cards, and the ever-present threat of violence for the smallest infraction. Helena's life before the war seemed like a memory from someone else's existence. She had been married to Tomasz, a schoolteacher with gentle hands and a passion for history. They had lived above the bakery, in rooms filled with books and the smell of fresh bread. They had been trying to start a family, hopeful about a future that seemed secure and predictable. Then September 1939 arrived, and with it came the invasion that shattered Poland like glass. Tomasz had joined the resistance in the early days, disappearing into forests with other men from the town. Helena had received word of his death in the spring of 1941, a brief message delivered by a young boy she didn't recognize, stating only that Tomasz had been killed in an ambush near the eastern border. There had been no body to bury, no grave to visit, just an absence that expanded to fill every corner of her life. In the months that followed, Helena had learned to survive in this new reality. She kept the bakery operating because it provided a legitimate reason to move around town, to interact with both the occupiers and her fellow Poles, and because the act of baking, of creating something from flour and water and heat, gave her a sense of purpose when everything else felt meaningless. But survival wasn't enough anymore. The grief that had initially paralyzed her had slowly transformed into something harder and more focused. She watched the German soldiers requisition food from starving families. She saw neighbors disappear in the night, taken to labor camps or worse. She heard the stories that filtered in from other towns, tales of massacres and deportations that seemed too horrific to be real, but were confirmed again and again. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, if you've ever wondered whether one person can truly make a difference when the world seems determined to crush hope, then you'll want to see how Helena's story unfolds. This is a journey that will show you the extraordinary power of ordinary courage. And if you subscribe now, you'll never miss another story of how real people fought back against impossible odds in the darkest chapter of human history. The idea came to Helena on a particularly bitter January morning in 1943. She had been measuring out her flour ration, calculating how many loaves she could produce with what she had, when Frau Schneider, the wife of the German commandant, entered the bakery. Frau Schneider was a tall woman in her 40s, always impeccably dressed despite the wartime shortages, with blonde hair styled in the fashion popular in Berlin and an air of superiority that preceded her like a cold front. She swept into the bakery as if she owned it, which in a sense she did, since her husband controlled everything in Kolno. "I need you to bake for a gathering we're hosting next week," Frau Schneider announced without preamble, her Polish heavily accented and delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. 3 dozen sweet rolls, 2 large cakes, and assorted pastries were entertaining officers from the regional command. Helena kept her expression neutral, though her mind raced. The ingredients for such an order would consume her entire month's ration and more. "I'm not sure I have sufficient supplies, Frau Schneider," she replied carefully in German, which she had learned from her father, who had traded with German merchants before the war. "The rations—" "I'm not interested in your limitations," Frau Schneider interrupted, examining her gloved hands with affected boredom. "Find a way. Perhaps you could organize one of those quaint little fundraisers you Polish women are so fond of, a charity bake sale." She laughed at her own suggestion, a sound like ice cracking. "You could sell your little cakes to the townspeople, raise funds for more supplies. I'm sure the commandant would approve. As long as everything is properly accounted for, it would show community spirit under our administration." The suggestion was made mockingly, a joke at Helena's expense, but as Frau Schneider swept out of the bakery, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume that seemed obscene in a town where people were slowly starving, Helena stood very still, the wheels of her mind turning. A charity bake sale. The Germans would see it as harmless, even amusing, a demonstration of how thoroughly they had domesticated the occupied population. But Helena saw something else entirely. She saw an opportunity. That night, after curfew, Helena made her way through the darkened streets to the home of Father Merrick, the elderly priest who had somehow managed to maintain his position at the town's Catholic church despite the occupation's hostility toward religious authority. She moved in the shadows, avoiding the main roads where German patrols made their rounds. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, which was both a blessing and a curse, providing cover but making navigation treacherous on the icy streets. She had wrapped her shoes in rags to muffle her footsteps, and her heart hammered so loudly in her chest she was certain it could be heard blocks away. Father Merrick answered her quiet knock immediately, as if he had been expecting someone, though perhaps not her specifically. He was a small man, bent with age, his face deeply lined and his hair pure white, but his eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, were sharp and knowing. He ushered her inside without a word, leading her to a small room behind the sacristy that served as his private quarters. A single candle burned on a rough wooden table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Helena," he said softly, gesturing for her to sit on one of 2 simple chairs. "What brings you out after curfew? This is dangerous." "Everything is dangerous now, Father," Helena replied, her voice barely above a whisper despite the relative safety of the room. "I need to reach the partisans in the forest. I need to contact whoever is coordinating resistance activities in this region. Do you know how I can do that?" Father Merrick was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the candlelight. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I might know someone who knows someone. But Helena, you must understand what you're risking. If the Germans discover you're involved with the resistance—" "They killed my husband," Helena interrupted, her voice hardening. "They've taken everything from this town, from this country. I can't just bake bread for them and pretend that's enough. I need to do something that matters." The priest reached across the table and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Tell me what you're planning." Helena explained Frau Schneider's mocking suggestion of charity bake sale, and as she spoke, the outline of her plan took shape. She would organize the sale, just as the German woman had suggested, but the funds raised wouldn't go toward baking for Nazi officers. Instead, the money would be funneled to the partisan groups operating in the forests surrounding Kolno. These fighters, remnants of the Polish army and civilians who had chosen armed resistance over submission, desperately needed resources. They needed weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, warm clothing, and food. Money could buy these things on the black market that thrived despite, or perhaps because of, the occupation. But more than that, Helena realized the bake sale could serve another purpose. It could be a cover for gathering intelligence. She could invite women from across the town, create a space where conversations could happen, where information could be shared quietly beneath the Germans' notice. She could learn about troop movements, supply shipments, patrol schedules, all the small details that could help the partisans plan their operations. Father Merrick listened intently, occasionally asking questions, probing for weaknesses in the plan. When Helena finished, he sat back in his chair, a slight smile touching his weathered face. "You've thought this through. It's risky, extraordinarily risky, but it could work. Give me 3 days. I'll make contact with someone who can connect you to the right people." Those 3 days felt like 3 years. Helena went through the motions of her daily routine, serving the few customers who had ration cards for bread, cleaning the bakery, maintaining the fiction of normalcy. But inside, she felt like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. She jumped at every unexpected sound, scrutinized every person who entered her shop, wondering if somehow her intentions had been discovered, if the Gestapo would burst through her door at any moment. On the third night, a woman Helena had never seen before appeared at her door just as she was closing the bakery. She was young, perhaps 20, with a plain face and worn clothing that marked her as a farm laborer. "Father Merrick said you have extra work for someone willing to do it." The young woman said, the sentence clearly a prearranged code. Helena nodded and quickly brought her inside, locking the door behind them. The woman introduced herself only as Cassia and wasted no time with pleasantries. She had been sent by the partisan commander operating in the Kolno region, a man known only as Wilk the Wolf. Cassia explained that Wilk's group, about 40 fighters strong, was part of the larger army of Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, which was coordinating resistance activities across occupied Poland. They were desperately short of funds. Their last supply cache had been discovered by the Germans, and winter was making operations increasingly difficult. "Your idea about using a charity bake sale is clever," Cassia said, her eyes appraising Helena with new respect. "Wilk wants to know how much you think you can raise, and how quickly." Helena had been calculating this for days. "If I can get participation from 50 women in the town, and if each contributes what they can, either through donations or by providing baked goods to sell, I estimate we could raise somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 zloty within a month. Maybe more if we can sell to some of the German soldiers who aren't as hostile, the ones who have money and want something sweet." Kasia's eyebrows rose. That was a substantial sum, equivalent to several months' wages for a working person before the war. On the black market, it could buy a dozen rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, medicine, winter coats, and food supplies that could keep a partisan unit operational through the harshest months. "Wilk will be pleased," Cassia said, "but you need to understand the risks. If you're caught, they won't just arrest you. They'll torture you for information about everyone you're working with, and then they'll execute you publicly as a warning to others. They might do worse. The Germans have been making examples of women. They catch helping the resistance." "I understand," Helena replied steadily. "My husband died fighting them. I'd rather die doing something useful than survive by doing nothing." They worked out a system for communication. Cassia would return every 10 days, always after dark, always using the code phrase about work. Helena would pass along any money she had collected, along with any intelligence she gathered about German activities in the town. In return, Cassia would occasionally bring instructions from Wilk, specific information he needed Helena to acquire or tasks he needed her to perform. The next morning, Helena went to the German administrative office to request permission to hold the charity bake sale. She was escorted into the commandant's office, a room that had once belonged to the mayor and was now dominated by a large German flag and a portrait of Hitler. Commandant Schneider sat behind an imposing desk, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a paunch that spoke of access to better food than the population he governed. Frau Schneider sat in a chair nearby, her expression smug as Helena explained her request. "Your wife suggested this," Helena said carefully, "as a way to raise funds for supplies so I could properly fulfill the order for your gathering. And I thought it might also be a way to show community cooperation with the administration." Commandant Schneider exchanged a look with his wife, and to Helena's carefully concealed relief, he seemed amused by the idea. "Yes, of course. A little Polish charity sale. How quaint. Very well, you have my permission, but there are conditions. You'll file a detailed report of all funds raised and spent. You'll hold a sale in the town square, where it can be monitored, and 10% of all proceeds will be donated to the Winter Relief Fund for German soldiers on the Eastern Front. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, Commandant," Helena replied, keeping her eyes downcast in a show of submission. "Thank you for your generosity in approving this." As she left the administrative building, she allowed herself the smallest of satisfied smiles. The Germans had just given her official permission to fund the partisan resistance. The irony was almost funny, though nothing was truly funny anymore in this occupied world where laughter had become a rare and precious commodity. Helena began organizing the bake sale with the same methodical care she applied to everything. She started by approaching women she knew and trusted, those who had lost family members to the occupation, those who had shown quiet signs of resistance in small ways. She went to Anna, whose son had been sent to a labor camp in Germany. She approached Sophia, whose husband had been executed for violating curfew. She spoke with Maria, whose parents had been Jewish and had been among those taken in the early deportations. Each conversation was careful, feeling out the woman's willingness to participate, never revealing the true purpose unless Helena was absolutely certain of their trustworthiness. To her surprise and growing hope, nearly every woman she approached agreed immediately. More than that, they understood without being explicitly told that this was about more than baking. The women of Kolno had been watching and waiting, nursing their own griefs and angers, looking for a way to fight back that didn't require them to pick up guns and disappear into the forest. This was something they could do, something that used the skills they had and operated within the boundaries of what was permitted, while subverting everything it appeared to be. The organizing meetings took place in Helena's bakery after hours, with women arriving separately and at different times to avoid suspicion. They sat around a large wooden table in the back room where Helena had once rolled out dough for hundreds of pastries, and they planned their resistance disguised as a charity event. Each woman would contribute what she could, either baked goods made from carefully hoarded ingredients or a small amount of money, or both. They would recruit other women, expanding their network carefully, always vetting new participants. "We need to make this look genuine," Helena explained to the group one evening, about 2 weeks into planning. "We'll actually give the Germans their 10%. We'll keep meticulous records, at least the records we show them. But for every zloty we report, we'll have actually raised 2 or 3 more that never appears on paper. We'll sell items for less than we actually charge, pocket the difference. We'll accept anonymous donations that never get recorded. We'll undercount our inventory. The key is making the numbers believable but not impressive enough to draw too much scrutiny." The women nodded, understanding the delicate balance Helena was describing. They were creating a financial magic trick, hiding the real numbers inside fake ones, conducting transactions in plain sight that funneled money to fighters in the forest while the Germans believed they were watching a harmless community gathering. As the planning progressed, Helena discovered something she hadn't expected: hope. For the first time since Tamasha's death, she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was doing something that mattered, and she wasn't alone. These women, gathered around her table in the dim light of carefully rationed candles, were reclaiming a small piece of power in a world that had tried to strip them of all agency. They were fighters in their own right, even if their weapons were flour and sugar instead of guns and grenades. The intelligence gathering began almost accidentally. One of the women, Katarzyna, worked as a cleaning woman in the German administrative building, and she mentioned in passing that she had overheard officers discussing a rail shipment scheduled to pass through the region. Helena's ears pricked up immediately. She drew Katarzyna aside after the meeting and asked her to pay attention to any similar conversations, to remember any details about dates, times, routes, or cargo. "I'm not sure what use that information would be," Katarzyna said hesitantly. Helena took the older woman's work-roughened hands in hers. "Trust me, Katarzyna. There are people who can use that information to hurt the Germans. Every piece of intelligence is a weapon we can use against them." Katarzyna's eyes widened with understanding, and then a fierce smile crossed her face. "I'll listen more carefully from now on." Other women had similar access to valuable information. Elzbieta's daughter had been conscripted to work in the officers' mess hall and heard them talking over meals. Jolanta's husband, one of the few men who hadn't been taken for labor or killed, worked at the rail depot and saw the manifests of incoming and outgoing shipments. Gradually, Helena began collecting a picture of German military activities in the region, details that she carefully wrote down in a code she and Kasia had developed, using recipe measurements and baking instructions to conceal information about troop movements and supply schedules. The charity bake sale was scheduled for a Saturday in late February, giving the women over a month to prepare. As the date approached, the excitement was palpable, though everyone maintained careful facades when in public. Helena had printed flyers, approved by the German administration, advertising the event. She had even convinced several German soldiers to agree to attend, appealing to their desire for fresh pastries and their apparent amusement at the Polish women's efforts. But 3 days before the scheduled sale, something happened that threatened to derail everything. A young boy appeared at Helena's door early one morning, pale and terrified, with a message from Kasia. The partisan group had been betrayed. Someone had informed the Germans about a planned operation, and a German patrol had ambushed Wilkes' unit in the forest. There had been casualties, though Kasia's message didn't specify how many or who. The survivors had scattered, and all resistance activities were being suspended temporarily, while they regrouped and tried to identify the traitor in their midst. Helena felt the news like a physical blow. She sat down heavily at her kitchen table, her hands shaking. Everything they had been working toward suddenly seemed pointless. The money they would raise had nowhere to go if there was no partisan unit to receive it. Worse, if there was a traitor feeding information to the Germans, how long before that person learned about the bake sale's true purpose? How long before Helena and all the women she had recruited were arrested? For several hours, Helena sat in her empty bakery, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of despair settling over her like a blanket. She thought about Tomasz, about his optimism even in the darkest times, his belief that people could endure anything if they refused to surrender their hope. She thought about the women who had trusted her, who had risked their safety because they believed they were part of something meaningful. She thought about the German officers who walked through Kolno's streets as if they owned the world, confident in their power, certain that the people they had conquered would never effectively fight back. Finally, as the winter sun climbed toward noon, painting weak light across the bakery's walls, Helena made her decision. They would proceed with the bake sale as planned. Even if the money couldn't immediately reach the partisans, it could be hidden, saved for when the resistance reorganized. The intelligence they gathered would still be valuable. And perhaps most importantly, canceling would draw attention and questions they couldn't afford. The Germans expected this event to happen. If it didn't, they would ask why, and those questions could lead to discoveries that would get people killed. Helena went to Father Merrick and explained the situation. Together, they developed a plan for securing the funds. The money would be hidden in the church, concealed in a space behind a loose stone in the sacristy wall that Father Merrick had used to hide religious items the Germans had forbidden. It would stay there, safe, until Kasia or another partisan contact made contact to arrange its collection. The morning of the bake sale arrived with weather that seemed designed to mock their efforts. A brutal wind swept down from the north, bringing with it temperatures well below freezing and snow that fell in hard, stinging flakes. Helena woke before dawn and made her way to the town square through the dark streets, pulling a wooden cart loaded with tables and supplies that she and several other women had collected. Despite the cold and the early hour, the other women began arriving soon after, each bringing what they had prepared, their faces red from the wind, their hands clumsy in thick mittens. They set up their stalls in the square, arranging baked goods on tables covered with threadbare cloths that had once been nice linens before the war. There were poppy seed rolls and honey cakes, fruit preserves made from carefully hoarded summer fruit, dark rye bread dense and hearty, sweet cheese pastries, and even a few elaborate torts that represented enormous sacrifices of butter and sugar. Each item was priced carefully, some marked for the prices that would appear in the official records, others carrying secret higher prices that would be charged to those buyers who understood what they were really supporting. The German soldiers began arriving mid-morning, more out of boredom and the desire for fresh baked goods than any real interest in the event itself. They walked between the stalls, making comments in German that some of the women couldn't understand, but that were clearly mocking, laughing at the Polish women's attempts at normalcy in their occupied town. Frau Schneider appeared with several other German officers' wives, dressed impeccably despite the cold, inspecting the goods with the air of people touring a quaint but ultimately inferior foreign market. How charming, Frau Schneider said loudly, picking up one of Helena's honey cakes and examining it critically. Polish baking. So rustic. She purchased several items, paying the marked prices with obvious condescension, clearly viewing the entire enterprise as an amusing display of conquered people performing for their conquerors. But as the morning progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Polish townspeople started arriving in larger numbers than Helena had anticipated. Families who barely had enough to feed themselves spent precious coins on pastries. Workers who should have been at their jobs found reasons to stop by the square. Even people from neighboring villages, who had somehow heard about the sale, made the dangerous journey to attend. And many of them, when they purchased items, pressed extra money into the seller's hands with knowing looks, adding anonymous donations that would never appear in any ledger. Helena moved between the stalls, helping to manage sales, keeping mental track of the real versus reported transactions, slipping excess money into a leather bag hidden beneath her coat. She watched the faces of her fellow townspeople and saw in their eyes the same thing she felt: defiance. These people understood, perhaps not the specific details of where the money was going, but certainly the spirit of what was happening. This was resistance. This was refusal. This was a small group of occupied people saying, through the simple act of buying pastries in the cold, that they had not been broken. By the time the afternoon sun began its early winter descent, they had sold nearly everything. The stalls were almost bare, and Helena's hidden bag was heavy with coins and a surprising number of bills. The official cash box, which would be presented to the German administration, contained a respectable but unimpressive sum. The real collection, the money that mattered, was nearly 3 times that amount. As the women began packing up their stalls, Commandant Schneider himself appeared in the square, accompanied by 2 soldiers. Helena's heart clenched with fear. Had someone talked? Did he know? But the commandant merely walked to Helena's stall, surveyed the nearly empty tables, and nodded with apparent satisfaction. "A successful event," he said in his heavily accented Polish. "I trust you'll have a full accounting of the proceeds ready for my office on Monday?" "Of course, Commandant," Helena replied, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "Every zloty has been carefully tracked." He seemed satisfied and turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at Helena with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know, Frau Kowalska, I'm actually impressed. When my wife suggested this, I thought it was a joke, but you organized something genuinely useful. Perhaps there's hope for cooperation between our peoples after all." Helena kept her face carefully neutral, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement, while inside she felt a fierce surge of satisfaction. If only he knew. If only he understood that these docile, cooperative Polish women he was praising had just executed a perfect act of economic sabotage right under his nose, that the money he believed was going to help fulfill his wife's pastry order would instead buy bullets that might one day be aimed at him and his soldiers. After the Germans left, the women worked quickly to clean up the square, but there was an energy among them now, a suppressed excitement that manifested in quick, meaningful glances and brief squeezes of hands. They had done it. They had pulled off their deception, and no one had been caught. That night, long after curfew, Helena made her way to Father Marek's church with a leather bag of money hidden beneath her coat. The streets were deadly quiet, and every shadow seemed to conceal danger. She moved carefully, stopping frequently to listen for patrols, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. When she finally reached the church, Father Marek was waiting, the side door unlocked. They went immediately to the sacristy, and together they removed the loose stone, tucked the bag into the dark space behind it, and carefully replaced the stone so no casual observer would ever notice anything amiss. "Over 2,000 zloty," Helena whispered, still hardly believing it. "Father, we actually raised over 2,000 zloty." The old priest smiled, and in the candlelight, his face seemed to glow with something like pride. "You've given hope to more than just the partisans, Helena. You've given it to everyone who participated today. You've shown them they're not powerless." The weeks that followed the bake sale were tense. Helena and the other women waited anxiously for any sign that their deception had been discovered, that someone had talked, or that the Germans had become suspicious of the discrepancy between what the sale appeared to raise and what had actually been collected. But the German administration seemed satisfied with the accounting Helena submitted. They took their 10% for the Winter Relief Fund, expressed approval at the community spirit displayed, and considered the matter closed. Helena continued her work at the bakery, fulfilling the order for Frau Schneider's gathering, producing the requested cakes and pastries from supplies she purchased with a small portion of the real money they had raised, careful to make it appear that the bake sale proceeds had been used exactly as stated. The German officers' party took place on a Saturday evening in mid-March, and Helena was required to deliver the baked goods personally to the commandant's residence, a house that had been seized from a Polish family who had been sent to a labor camp. She stood in the kitchen of that house, surrounded by German officers in their crisp uniforms, their wives in expensive dresses, watching them eat the pastries she had made while they laughed and drank champagne, and she felt a kind of cold satisfaction. These people, so confident in their superiority, had no idea they had been fooled. They had no idea that the humble Polish baker standing quietly in the corner of their kitchen was part of a network of resistance, that the money raised under their approval and supervision was at that very moment hidden in a church, waiting to be transformed into weapons that would be used against them. It was nearly a month before Kasia appeared again at Helena's door after dark. The young woman looked thinner, more worn than before, but there was a new intensity in her eyes. "Wilk survived the ambush," she said without preamble. "We lost 8 fighters, and the traitor was identified and dealt with. We're regrouping, but we're operational again. And we need that money now. Wilk has a major operation planned. Over the next several nights, working in careful stages to avoid suspicion, Helena and Father Merrick moved the money from its hiding place to a new location, an abandoned farm outside of town, where Kasia could safely collect it. The transaction happened in the dead of night, with Helena barely sleeping, jumping at every sound, certain that this was when they would be discovered. But somehow, impossibly, the transfer completed without incident. 2 weeks later, Helena was working in her bakery when she heard the explosion. It was distant but unmistakable, a deep boom that rattled the windows and brought everyone in the street to a halt. Within an hour, the town was buzzing with news. A German supply train carrying ammunition and fuel to the Eastern Front had been derailed and destroyed about 30 kilometers outside of Kolno. The explosion had been massive, destroying not just a train, but a section of the rail line itself. Dozens of German soldiers had been killed, and the supply route would be disrupted for weeks while repairs were made. That evening, Kasia appeared briefly at Helena's door, staying just long enough to whisper 7 words. "Your money bought the explosives." "Thank you." Then she was gone, melting back into the darkness. Helena stood in her doorway, looking out at the occupied town, and allowed herself a moment of fierce joy. The bake sale that the Germans had mocked, that Frau Schneider had suggested as a joke, that Commandant Schneider had approved as a harmless display of cooperation, had directly funded a major partisan operation. The funds raised by women selling pastries in the town square had translated into a successful attack that had dealt real damage to the German war machine. Every zloty carefully hidden. Every transaction conducted in plain sight while concealing its true nature had mattered. But this was just the beginning. Over the following months, Helena and her network of women continued their work, adapting and expanding their methods. They organized more sales, each time perfecting their techniques for concealing the true amounts raised. They held knitting circles that were actually intelligence-gathering sessions, where women shared information they had overheard or observed. They created what appeared to be a community mutual aid network, helping families in need, but which was actually a system for moving money, supplies, and occasionally people who needed to disappear. The women became bolder as they became more confident. Elzbieta, whose daughter worked in the officers' mess, began occasionally adding crushed glass to meals, not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough to make the soldiers sick and unable to perform their duties. Sophia, who had access to German vehicles when they came to her husband's repair shop, began loosening bolts and making subtle sabotages that would cause breakdowns miles from town. Maria started a seemingly innocent local newsletter with German approval, ostensibly sharing community news, but which contained coded messages for resistance members hidden within innocent-seeming announcements. Helena coordinated all of it, maintaining the appearance of simple baker while actually functioning as an intelligence hub and financial coordinator for the resistance in the Kolno region. She developed sources of information throughout the town, learning to piece together fragments of overheard conversations, noticed patterns, and small observations into actionable intelligence. She mapped German patrol routes, tracked officer routines, documented supply deliveries, and passed all of it along through her contacts of partisan commanders who used it to plan their operations. The risk escalated with each action. The Gestapo had established a presence in Kolno, suspicious that the town had become a center of resistance activity given the increasing partisan attacks in the region. They began interrogating random civilians, searching homes without warning, imposing stricter curfews and harsher penalties for violations. Several people were arrested on suspicion of resistance involvement, and 3 men were publicly executed in the town square as a warning. One night in August of 1943, Helena received word that the Gestapo had identified her bakery as a location of interest. Someone, either through observation or information from an informant, had noted the unusual amount of activity around her shop, the late-night visitors, the sense that something more than baking was happening there. Cassie brought the warning. You need to stop operations immediately. Destroy anything incriminating. They're planning to raid your bakery within the next few days. Helena spent that night burning documents, emptying hiding places, ensuring that if the Germans searched her bakery, they would find nothing but what they expected. A struggling business trying to survive under occupation. She sent word to the network that all activities were suspended, that everyone should distance themselves from her and from each other until the danger passed. The raid came 3 days later, in the hour before dawn. Helena woke to pounding on her door, German voices shouting commands. She opened it to find 6 Gestapo officers, their leather coats black in the dim light, their faces hard and suspicious. They pushed past her without explanation, beginning a methodical search of the bakery and her living quarters above it. For 2 hours, they took apart her life. They opened every container, read every document, examined every corner. They questioned her aggressively, demanding to know who visited her, what she did with her time, whether she had any contact with partisans. Helena answered calmly, maintaining the persona she had carefully constructed, a widow trying to survive, loyal to the administration, focused only on keeping her business operating. She showed them her official permits, her accounting books that recorded only the sanctioned transactions, her inventory that matched her ration records. The lead Gestapo officer, a thin man with cold eyes and a scar across his cheek, stood very close to Helena, tried to intimidate her with his physical presence. We know there is resistance activity in this town, he said in perfect Polish, which somehow made him more frightening. We know people are helping the bandits in the forest, and we know that bakeries make excellent cover for illegal activities. Large ovens that can dispose of evidence. Legitimate reasons for people to come and go. Reasons to have supplies and materials. I only bake bread, Helena replied, keeping her voice steady. I only try to survive. In the end, they found nothing because there was nothing to find. Helena had been careful, and the warning had given her time to remove any evidence. The Gestapo left, but the lead officer paused in the doorway, turning back to look at Helena with an expression that suggested he knew she was lying but couldn't prove it. We'll be watching you, Frau Kowalska, he said. If you're involved in anything illegal, we will discover it. And when we do, you'll wish you had been more cooperative today. After they left, Helena sat on the floor of her bakery, shaking with reaction. She had come within inches of being arrested, tortured, killed. For the first time since she had begun this work, she felt true terror, understanding viscerally what she was risking. But she also felt something else. Determination. The Germans had shown their hand. They were suspicious, but they had no proof, and that meant she could continue. She just had to be more careful, more clever. She couldn't stop now, not when the work was making a real difference, not when there were still battles to be fought and ways to fight them. Over the following year, Helena adapted her methods to the increased scrutiny. She stopped holding meetings at her bakery, instead conducting coordination through a chain of intermediaries who never knew the full scope of the network. She developed new codes for communication, hiding messages in seemingly innocent recipe exchanges, in the prices she charged for different items, in the patterns of when she opened and closed her shop. She began using children as couriers, knowing the Germans paid less attention to young boys and girls carrying bread deliveries. The partisan operations continued, funded increasingly by the money Helena's network raised and laundered through various fronts. The rail line was hit twice more. A German fuel depot was destroyed. Officers were assassinated. Supply convoys were ambushed. Each action weakened the German occupation, made them less secure, forced them to divert resources to protecting their own infrastructure that would otherwise have been used fighting on the front lines. The women of Helena's network suffered losses. Katarzyna was arrested after a Gestapo officer realized she had been listening to confidential conversations. She was interrogated but revealed nothing and died in German custody from what was officially reported as natural causes, but was almost certainly murder. Elżbieta's daughter was discovered sabotaging meals and was sent to a concentration camp. Zofia's husband was executed when his sabotage of German vehicles became too obvious to ignore. Each loss hurt. Each death added weight to the burden Helena carried. She mourned them privately, unable to openly acknowledge their sacrifices, unable to explain to their families that these women had died as soldiers in an undeclared war. But she also honored them by continuing the work, by making sure their sacrifices meant something. By the summer of 1944, the war's tide was turning. The Soviets were pushing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. The German occupation became increasingly brutal as it became increasingly desperate. Reprisals against civilian populations intensified. Mass executions became common. The Gestapo abandoned any pretense of due process, arresting and killing people on the slightest suspicion. In July, Helena learned through her intelligence network that the Germans were planning a major operation against the partisan units in the region. They had assembled a large force, including experienced soldiers pulled from other fronts, and were planning a sweep of the forest that would attempt to destroy the resistance in Kolno's territory once and for all. The operation was scheduled for mid-August, and if it succeeded, it would effectively end organized resistance in the region. Helena knew this information had to reach Wilk and the other partisan commanders immediately. But the Gestapo presence in Kolno had become so intense that any attempt to make contact was extraordinarily dangerous. The normal chains of communication had been disrupted by arrests and deaths. Kasia hadn't appeared in over a month, and Helena had no way of knowing if she was alive or dead. Finally, Helena made a decision that she knew was probably suicidal, but which she saw as necessary. She would go to the forest herself, find the partisans personally, and deliver the warning. It was the only way to ensure the information reached them in time. She prepared carefully, gathering a small pack of supplies and creating a cover story for her absence. She told her few remaining customers that she was closing the bakery for several days to visit a sick relative in a neighboring town, a fiction backed up by forged travel documents Father Merrick helped her create. She said goodbye to no one, not wanting to endanger anyone else with knowledge of her plans. On an August evening, she left Kolno on foot, taking forest paths she remembered from childhood, moving slowly and carefully to avoid German patrols. She traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in hollows and thickets, eating sparingly from the supplies she had brought. She had a vague idea of where the partisan camps were located, based on information she had pieced together from fragments of intelligence over the months, but nothing certain. On the third day, exhausted and beginning to doubt whether she would ever find the partisans before the Germans found her, Helena was suddenly surrounded by armed men who materialized from the forest so quickly and silently that she had no time to react. They were dressed in a mixture of civilian clothing and pieces of military uniforms, all of them carrying weapons, their faces hard and suspicious. "Who are you?" the leader demanded, his rifle pointed at her chest. "Why are you in the forest?" "I'm looking for Wilk," Helena said, her voice hoarse from thirst and fear. "I have information about a German operation planned against your units. I'm Helena Kowalska from Kolno. I run the bakery. I've been working with you for over a year, funneling money and intelligence through a contact named Kasia." The men exchanged glances, and after a tense moment, the leader lowered his rifle slightly. "Kasia is dead. She was captured 3 weeks ago. Come with us." They brought her deeper into the forest, to a hidden camp where about 30 fighters were based. The camp was sophisticated, with concealed bunkers dug into the earth, camouflage supply caches, and defensive positions that would make any attack costly for the Germans. And there, Sitting by a small fire that produced almost no smoke was a man in his 40s with graying hair and a face marked by a long scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. Wilk! He looked at Helena with an expression of surprise and, possibly, respect. The baker from Kolno. Kasia told me about you before she died. She said you were the most effective intelligence source in the region, that the money you raised had funded more of our operations than any other source. I'm honored to meet you, though I wish the circumstances were different. What brings you into the forest at such risk? Helena explained what she had learned about the planned German operation, providing every detail she could remember about troop numbers, timing, routes, and objectives. Wilk and several other partisan commanders listened intently, occasionally asking questions, their faces growing more serious as they understood the scope of the German plan. If what you say is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt you, they're planning to trap us, Wilk said finally. They'll sweep from multiple directions, cutting off our escape routes, boxing us in. It would be a massacre. He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire, thinking. But if we know they're coming, we can turn it around. We can prepare ambushes, set traps, hit them before they expect it. We can make them pay so dearly for entering this forest that they'll think twice about trying again. Over the next 2 days, Helena stayed in the partisan camp, helping them refine their plans. She provided additional intelligence about German forces in Kolno, about officers' routines, about supply schedules and patrol patterns. She watched these fighters, many of them younger than her, preparing for a battle that many of them would probably not survive, and she felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. On the morning she was to return to Kolno, Wilk walked with her to the edge of the camp. You've risked everything to bring us this information, he said. You've funded our operations, provided intelligence that saved lives, and now you've literally walked into danger to warn us. You're a soldier, Helena Kowalska, as much as any fighter in this forest, more so than many. When this war is over, if we survive it, your name should be remembered. I don't want to be remembered, Helena replied. I just want this to end. I want Poland to be free again. Then we're fighting for the same thing, Wilk said, and he embraced her briefly before sending her back through the forest with 2 fighters as escorts who would get her safely past the German lines. Helena returned to Kolno to find the town in turmoil. Her absence had been noticed, despite her cover story, and the Gestapo had been to her bakery twice looking for her. Neighbors told her that officers had been asking questions about where she had gone, whether anyone had seen her leave, when she was expected to return. She knew that her window of safety had closed, that she was now actively under suspicion. 2 weeks later, the German operation against the Partisans launched, and exactly as Wilk had planned, it became a disaster for the occupation forces. The Partisans, forewarned and prepared, turned the forest into a killing ground. German units were ambushed repeatedly, their columns attacked from concealed positions, their supply lines cut, their communications disrupted. The operation that was supposed to destroy the resistance instead became one of the most successful partisan victories in the region, with dozens of German soldiers killed and the survivors retreating in disarray. The German response was predictable and brutal. Unable to defeat the partisans in the forest, they turned their fury on the civilian population they believed was supporting the fighters. There were mass arrests in Kolno and surrounding towns. Houses were burned. People were executed in public squares. The Gestapo began conducting interrogations with increased savagery, trying to extract information about who was helping the resistance. Helena knew it was only a matter of time before they came for her. The pieces were all there, visible to anyone looking carefully. Her bakery's role as a meeting place, her unexplained absence during critical weeks, the pattern of partisan successes that correlated with her activities. She began making preparations for arrest, hiding certain items that might help her in German custody, memorizing cover stories that might deflect some suspicion, preparing herself mentally for what interrogation would mean. The arrest came on a September morning, without warning or ceremony. Gestapo officers simply appeared at her bakery, placed her in handcuffs, and drove her to their headquarters in a building that had once been the town hall. She was taken to a basement room with concrete walls and no windows, and there she was left alone for hours, a psychological tactic designed to increase fear and uncertainty. When the interrogation finally began, it was conducted by the same scarred officer who had searched her bakery a year earlier. He sat across from her at a simple metal table, a file folder open in front of him containing what appeared to be surveillance reports and witness statements. Frau Kowalska, he began almost conversationally, "We've been watching you for a long time. We know you're involved with the Partisans. We know you've been funneling money and information to them. We know your bakery has been a center of resistance activity. What we don't know yet is the full extent of your network, the names of everyone you've been working with. But we will learn these things one way or another." "I don't know what you're talking about," Helena replied, keeping her voice calm despite her pounding heart. "I run a bakery. I bake bread. That's all I do." The interrogation continued for hours, the officer alternating between apparent friendliness and sudden anger, trying different approaches to break her down. He showed her documents, some of them legitimate evidence, and others probably fabricated, claiming to have proof of her activities. He made threats about what would happen to her if she didn't cooperate, describing torture and execution in clinical detail. He made promises about leniency if she provided names, suggesting she could save herself if she was willing to betray her accomplices. Helena said nothing of value. She maintained her simple story. She was a baker, a widow trying to survive, loyal to the administration, guilty of nothing. She didn't know what evidence they actually had, what they were guessing at, what they were trying to trick her into confirming. So she said nothing that could be used against her or anyone else. After 12 hours, they returned her to cell, a small concrete space with no bed, no toilet except for a bucket in the corner, and no light except what filtered in from a crack under the door. She was given no food, no water. This was another tactic, designed to soften her for the next interrogation session. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. Interrogation sessions that lasted for hours, conducted by different officers using different techniques. Periods of isolation in the cell, sometimes in complete darkness, sometimes with lights so bright they made sleep impossible. Deprivation of food and water, followed by sudden offerings of meals as rewards for cooperation. Physical abuse that began subtly and gradually escalated. Helena endured it all, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She thought of Tomasz, of how he had died fighting for something he believed in. She thought of the women in her network who had risked everything. She thought of the partisan fighters in the forest, of young men and women continuing the battle against impossible odds. And she refused to give the Germans anything they could use. On the 8th day of her detention, something changed. She was brought from her cell not to an interrogation room, but to a different office, one that was furnished more comfortably, where the scarred Gestapo officer sat behind a desk with an expression that suggested he had made a decision about something. "Frau Kowalska," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you. We don't have enough evidence to prosecute you effectively. Yes, we're suspicious of you. Yes, there are patterns that suggest involvement with the resistance. But we don't have witnesses who will testify against you. We don't have documents that definitively prove your guilt, and you've proven remarkably resistant to our interrogation techniques. We could execute you anyway, of course, but our commanders have decided that random executions without clear cause are counterproductive at this stage of the war." He paused, studied her face for any reaction. Helena kept her expression neutral, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "So I'm releasing you," he continued. "But understand this. We will continue watching you. Every person you speak with, every transaction you conduct, every moment of every day will be observed. If you engage in any suspicious activity, if you contact the resistance in any way, we will know immediately. And next time there will be no interrogation, no attempt to extract information. There will only be execution. Do you understand?" "Yes," Helena replied, her voice hoarse from days of limited water. "Good. Then you're free to return to your bakery and your life. Be grateful for the mercy you've been shown, and don't make us regret it." Helena walked out of the Gestapo headquarters into afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after days in darkness. She made her way slowly back to her bakery, her body aching, her mind still processing the fact that she was alive and free. When she reached her shop, she found it had been ransacked during her detention. Supplies scattered, equipment damaged, a clear message about what happened to people who attracted German attention. She also found, hidden under a loose board beneath her counter, where she had once kept her most important papers, a small note that had been slipped there somehow during her detention. It was signed and written in code she recognized, and when she decoded it, the message was simple: "Thank you for your silence. The network survives. The fight continues." For the next several months, Helena did exactly what the Gestapo officer had warned her to do. Nothing suspicious. She rebuilt her bakery, served her customers, maintained the appearance of complete normalcy. She knew she was being watched, could sometimes spot the surveillance, could feel the eyes on her. So she gave them nothing to see, no evidence, no contact with resistance members, no suspicious activities. But she wasn't idle. She had spent her time in detention, thinking about new methods, safer approaches, and she began implementing them with extraordinary care. She developed a system of communication that involved customers, where the types of bread they ordered and the way they paid conveyed coded information that was passed along through chains of innocent-seeming transactions. She began embedding messages in the bread itself, using patterns of seeds on the crust that could be read by those who knew the code. She turned her bakery into a passive intelligence gathering post, with a simple act of conducting business allowed her to observe German activities and collect information that could be passed along without any direct contact with resistance members. By early 1945, the Soviet army was approaching from the east, and the German occupation was clearly in its final months. The Germans began evacuating, destroying records, preparing to retreat. The town of Kolno existed in a strange state of suspended anticipation, waiting for liberation, but uncertain what form it would take or what new occupation might replace the old one. Helena had survived. Against all odds, through years of dangerous work, through arrests and interrogation, through losses and near misses, she had survived. And more importantly, the network she had helped create had survived, had made a real difference in the resistance effort, had contributed to the eventual defeat of the occupation. The liberation came on a cold January morning in 1945, when Soviet tanks rolled into Kolno and the remaining German forces fled or surrendered. The townspeople emerged cautiously into the streets, uncertain whether to celebrate or fear what new reality was being imposed on them. Helena stood in the doorway of her bakery, watching history turn another page, feeling exhausted and empty and grateful to have lived to see this day. In the weeks that followed, as the town began the complex process of rebuilding and mourning, and accounting for who had survived and who had been lost, stories began to emerge about the resistance. People who had operated in secret for years could finally acknowledge what they had done. Networks that had remained hidden became visible, and slowly, the scope of Helena's role became known. The women who had worked with her came forward, sharing their stories of the bake sale and the intelligence gathering and the money they had hidden and funneled to the partisans. Surviving partisan fighters arrived in town, including Wilk himself, and they spoke publicly about the importance of the financial and intelligence support they had received from Kolno, about operations that had succeeded because someone had provided warning of German plans, about weapons that had been purchased with money raised at seemingly innocent community events. Helena found herself suddenly regarded as a hero, a recognition she found deeply uncomfortable. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had done what needed to be done, who had lost people she cared about, who had been terrified most of the time and lucky to have survived. The real heroes, she believed, were the people who had died, the fighters who had given everything to force, the women who had been arrested and never came home, her husband Tomasz who had been gone so long, she sometimes struggled to remember his face clearly, but she accepted the recognition gracefully, understanding that people needed heroes, needed stories of successful resistance, needed to believe that their suffering had meaning, and that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences. So when they asked to speak about her experiences, she did, though she always emphasized the collective nature of what had been accomplished, the dozens of women and men who had contributed, the network rather than any individual. She reopened her bakery fully, no longer operating under occupation restrictions, able to bake freely for the first time in years. The smell of fresh bread filled the streets of Kolno again, a small symbol of return to normal life. She trained young apprentices, passing on not just baking skills but stories of the war, making sure that what had happened would not be forgotten. Years later, when historians began documenting the resistance activities during the occupation, they would identify Helena Kowalska's network as one of the most successful civilian resistance operations in the region. The charity bake sale that had been mocked by German occupiers had funded operations that disrupted supply lines, destroyed material, and killed dozens of German soldiers. The intelligence gathered by women in seemingly innocent social settings had provided warnings that saved partisan lives and enabled successful ambushes. The network had operated for nearly 3 years without being completely compromised, an extraordinary achievement in an environment where betrayal and arrest were constant threats. But more than the tactical successes, what Helena's story represented was the power of ordinary people to resist extraordinary evil. In a time when it seemed impossible to fight back, when the occupiers appeared unbeatable, when the price of resistance was torture and death, a group of women armed with nothing more than baking skills, courage, and determination had found a way to strike back. They had transformed everyday activities into acts of war, had hidden rebellion inside the mundane, had proven that no occupation could be total as long as people refused to be completely conquered. If you've stayed with Helena's story this far, if you felt the weight of the choices she made and the courage it took to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless, then you understand why these stories matter. These aren't just historical accounts. They're reminders that ordinary people have always found ways to resist, to fight back, to make a difference even when the odds seemed impossible. Every story I share on this channel is carefully researched and told with respect for the real people who live these experiences. And if that resonates with you, I hope you'll consider liking this video and leaving a comment with the words courage and ordinary so I know you made it to the end. These stories deserve to be remembered, and there are so many more waiting to be told. In the next video, you'll discover another remarkable woman whose wartime choices changed lives in ways no one expected, a story of impossible decisions and unexpected heroism that I think you'll find just as powerful as Helena's. I'll see you there.